At its core, the transatlantic slave trade was triggered by a centuries-long clash between two powerful religious and cultural forces, Christianity and Islam. By tracing the origins of these systems, we can better understand not just how the trade began, but how its effects continue to shape our world today. The story of the trade did not begin with European ships on the African coast. It was shaped by centuries of global power struggles, religious conflicts, and economic transformations. The rise of Islamic empires, the Crusades, and the Reconquista of Spain and Portugal all played a role in shaping the ideological and economic systems that would later justify and sustain the transatlantic slave trade. An in-depth analysis of the institution of slavery and its nuances around the world is beyond the scope of this video. However, it is essential to give some attention to the subject. Before we deep dive into the transatlantic slave trade, let us first look back to a major turning point in human history that significantly influenced the increase in the global slave population. The 7th century experienced a dramatic shift with the emergence of Islamic civilization. During its golden age, Islamic civilization expanded in less than a century, from the Arabian Peninsula to Spain and India, transforming vast regions through a complete cultural and linguistic metamorphosis that revolutionized trade, science, and art, while inheriting all the wisdom of the ancient world and establishing itself as arguably the greatest civilization the world had ever seen for the next 1,000 years. By the 10th century, the Islamic caliphates began their gradual decline. Yet, even during this period, known as the Islamic Golden Age, the world witnessed unparalleled advancements in science, medicine, philosophy, and the arts. Cities like Baghdad and Cordoba became beacons of knowledge, attracting scholars from across the globe. But beneath the surface, something more dark and sinister was taking place. With the expansion of Islamic empires, the demand for slaves surged and involved the enslavement of people from diverse regions, including Africa, Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. It is estimated that between 10 to 15 million souls were sold into slavery over the course of 1,000 years. The majority of these slaves were women, who became concubines and household servants, a stark contrast to the Atlantic slave trade, where 2/3 of the enslaved were men forced into plantation labor. Estimates suggest that around 65 to 75% of the individuals enslaved in the Arab Islamic slave trade were African. In early Islam, Caliph Umar decreed several rights for concubines who bore children. A concubine could not be separated from her child or sold. Her child would be considered free and legally equal to the children born to the master's wife, and at the death of her master, she would be freed. This shaped families in unique ways, where enslaved mothers and free children lived under one roof. It blurred social lines and, in some cases, reshaping household and community dynamics. These rules had a tremendous impact on the nature of slavery in the Muslim world. Children born to slaves often rose to leadership positions within their families and communities. According to one estimate, 34 out of 37 rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate were born to slave mothers. Male slaves also played a significant role in Islamic societies. The Mamluk soldiers, enslaved from Central Asia and the Caucasus, became a powerful military class, while others served in domestic roles. In the 7th century, the world's population was approximately 200 million people. As societies grew, so did their demand for labor, a demand often met through slavery. With the expansion of Islamic empires, the demand for slaves surged, and the trade routes connecting Africa, Arabia, and beyond became conduits for human suffering. When Europeans began exploring and colonizing the Americas, they only had to plug into the existing system of slavery, which was already primed for rapid mass exportation of people. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, was built on the foundations laid by centuries of Islamic slave trading. By the 11th century, the once mighty Abbasid Caliphate had fragmented, leaving the Islamic world divided among regional powers. In Asia, the Seljuk Turks emerged as a dominant force, while in Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate held sway. This political fragmentation made the region vulnerable to outside attacks. Meanwhile, the Christian Crusaders launched a series of wars to seize holy sites from Muslim control. In 1198, they stunned the Islamic world by seizing Jerusalem. These conflicts were driven largely by religion, as European Christians viewed the conquest and enslavement of non-Christians as a divine act, a way to bring the word of God to the infidels. To the Crusaders, warring against non-Christians was a service to God. Since the 8th century, Islamic societies had established themselves as a dominant force. In 711 CE, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, which they called Al-Andalus. For centuries, Al-Andalus flourished as a center of learning and culture. Centuries later, Christian kingdoms in the north began a 400-year crusade to seize the land, a period known as the Reconquista. By the 11th century, Europe was emerging from a period of fragmentation and decline that had followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Once a collection of warring kingdoms, Europe was now increasingly unified under Christianity, with the Pope serving as its spiritual leader and a key political influencer. Throughout history, religion has been used to justify war, conquest, and slavery. But the European approach to religious war wasn't entirely original. Instead, it was shaped by centuries of contact with the Islamic world. From the Crusades to the Reconquista, European rulers observed, fought against, and ultimately adopted elements of Islamic jihad, twisting it to serve their own purposes. Jihad in Islam meant struggle in the path of God. It had both a spiritual and military meaning. In war, it was structured around three options for non-Muslims. 1. Convert to Islam. 2. Accept Islamic rule and pay a tax, jizya. Or 3. Resist and face war, death, or enslavement. For centuries, Muslim rulers used this framework in the expansion of Islamic empires. Prisoners of war were enslaved, but they were not permanently bound to servitude. Many could earn their freedom, and some, like the Mamluks of Egypt and the Ottoman Janissaries, even rose to power. But when Christian Europe borrowed this model, they made one crucial change. Slavery was no longer temporary. It became permanent and racialized. During the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule, Catholic monarchs repurposed jihad into their own version of holy war. Muslim and Jewish populations were given the same three choices. 1. Convert to Christianity. 2. Accept Christian rule and be taxed. And 3. Resist and face war or enslavement. The Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal absorbed military strategies, financial systems, and even slave trading models from the Islamic world. They fought like their Muslim counterparts, but applied an even harsher doctrine. By the 15th century, the Catholic Church took it one step further. The papal bulls of 1452 and 1455, issued by Pope Nicholas V, explicitly authorized Spain and Portugal to enslave non-Christians. This religious justification merged with economic ambition, leading directly to the transatlantic slave trade. But unlike in Islamic societies, where slaves could be freed and integrated, European slavery was permanent, hereditary, and tied to race. The logic of religious war had evolved into something new, a system where people were no longer enslaved because of conquest alone, but because of the color of their skin. The transatlantic slave trade did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of centuries of religious war, conquest, and adaptation. It was the result of European powers taking the jihad model of war and enslavement and transforming it into a global system of racial exploitation. The foundation had been laid. What began as a struggle over faith had become something much larger, a global empire built on the backs of the enslaved. By the year 1200 CE, the Islamic world had reached the twilight of its golden age. For centuries, it had been a beacon of knowledge, culture, and power, with cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba standing as centers of learning and innovation. Yet, the winds of change were blowing. The Crusades, which had begun over a century earlier, had exposed Europe to the wealth and wisdom of the Islamic world, sparking a period of transformation in the West. After 400 years of conflict, the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal finally completed the Reconquista in 1492 with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. This victory marked the end of Muslim rule in Spain and the beginning of a new era of European expansion. After at least 7 failed attempts over 200 years to capture the Holy Land, 2 major events shifted European focus away from the East toward the New World. First, the rise of the Ottoman Empire cut off the overland routes through the Middle East that linked the lucrative Far East spice trade to the West. Second, after 400 years of continuous religious war, 2 new empires emerged from the ashes of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, united under Christianity and driven by a hunger for wealth and power. But first, they turned inward. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, sought to purify their kingdoms by targeting Jews and Muslims. In 1492, the same year Spain completed its Reconquista with the fall of Granada. The Alhambra decree ordered all Jews to convert or leave. Tens of thousands were expelled, while those who stayed faced relentless persecution as conversos. Muslims, forced to convert and known as Moriscos, met a similar fate, culminating in their expulsion a century later. With the blessing of the Pope, Spain and Portugal embarked on a mission to conquer and colonize. At the dawn of the Age of Exploration, Spain and Portugal stood unrivaled. Backed by the Catholic Church, these 2 Iberian powers justified their expansion. In 1492, the same year Spain completed its Reconquista, Christopher Columbus sailed westward, opening the door to the New World. As Spain and Portugal established their dominance over the Atlantic and beyond, a major agreement shaped the trajectory of European colonialism. In 1494, under the mediation of Pope Alexander VI, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe along an imaginary line roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain was granted dominion over most of the Americas, while Portugal was awarded territories in Africa, Asia, and what would later become Brazil. This papal decree not only formalized Spain and Portugal's spheres of influence, but also laid the groundwork for the rapid expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. With Portuguese control over African coastal territories and Brazil, they had direct access to both the supply and demand for enslaved labor. Meanwhile, Spain's vast empire in the Americas created an insatiable need for labor, fueling the mass forced migration of Africans across the Atlantic. This treaty ensured that, for nearly a century, Spain and Portugal remained the unrivaled superpowers in global trade, including the human trafficking networks that would define the transatlantic slave trade. However, this dominance would not go unchallenged. Soon, European powers would take turns dominating this brutal trade, each leaving their mark on the lives of enslaved Africans and the economies of the New World. The transatlantic slave trade did not emerge in a vacuum. It was built upon centuries of economic ambition, religious justification, and systemic exploitation. By understanding these foundations, we gain insight into how human lives were commodified, how entire societies were reshaped, and how the echoes of this history still reverberate today. The conquest of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade were not just about wealth and power. They were a Christian jihad. Spain and Portugal, backed by the Catholic Church, saw themselves as warriors of God, expanding Christendom by force. Much like the Islamic jihads of earlier centuries, this was a holy war, but one waged through conquest, slavery, and colonization. With papal decrees blessing their campaigns, they seized lands, enslaved entire populations, and justified it all in the name of faith. The doctrine of discovery became their weapon, and the world would never be the same. To understand the true nature of this global conquest, we must go back to where it all began.
We ask and require you to acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world and the high priest called the Pope, and in his name the King and Queen of Spain as lords of this land. If you do so, you will do well, and we shall receive you in love and charity and leave you your lands free. But if you do not, or delay in doing so, we shall make war against you in all ways we can, and shall take you and your wives and children and make slaves of them, and we shall do you all the harm and damage we can as to vassals who do not obey, and we protest that the deaths and losses that shall come from this will be your fault and not that of their highnesses nor ours.
The conquest of the Americas was more than a series of battles. It was a collision of civilizations. The Spanish, vastly outnumbered, faced mighty indigenous empires, but they did not fight alone. They turned rivals against each other, exploited weaknesses, and, when the dust settled, their allies realized they had been betrayed. Before the Spanish arrived, the Americas were home to advanced civilizations. The Aztec and Inca empires ruled through military dominance and vast networks of alliances. Yet their power would not be enough to stop an enemy who fought differently. The Aztecs had a prophecy that the god Quetzalcoatl would return in the year 1 Reed, 1519. When Cortés arrived, Moctezuma hesitated, an uncertainty that would cost him his empire.
If he believes we are gods, we will let him. Time is on our side.
With only 500 men, Cortés could not defeat 200,000 Aztec warriors alone. But he didn't have to. The Tlaxcalans, long oppressed by the Aztecs, saw the Spanish as liberators. What they did not realize was that they were simply replacing one ruler with another. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes. Unlike the Aztecs, the Inca Empire was already weakened, torn apart by civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Pizarro knew that this division was his greatest advantage. Unlike Moctezuma, Atahualpa did not believe the Spanish were divine, but he underestimated their strategy. The Inca had never faced gunpowder, cavalry, or steel weapons before. As thousands of Inca warriors stood in formation, Pizarro and his 168 soldiers prepared their ambush. Atahualpa, confident in his numbers, had no idea what was coming. Cannons tore through the Incan ranks, muskets picked off warriors from a distance, and cavalry trampled the rest. The battle was over before it had begun. Atahualpa was captured, and the Spanish took control of the empire. Though Atahualpa was executed, the Inca resistance continued for decades. It was not until 1572, when the last stronghold of Vilcabamba fell, that the Inca Empire was fully conquered. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's journey set in motion a new era, one that would see Spain lay claim to vast lands across the Americas. In the decades that followed, Spanish conquistadors dismantled powerful empires, from the Aztecs in Mexico to the Incas in the Andes. These civilizations, known for their grand cities, sophisticated technologies, and rich cultures, crumbled under the weight of conquest. Before the rise of the plantation economy, Spain relied on an older system of wealth extraction, the tribute system, a model rooted in medieval Europe and the Islamic world. Rather than immediately reshaping their colonies into large-scale agricultural enterprises, the Spanish imposed a system where indigenous populations were forced to pay tribute in the form of gold, silver, food, textiles, and labor. Many empires before them, including the Moors, Ottomans, and Mongols, had used tribute to extract wealth from conquered lands. To govern their vast new territories, Spain established 4 viceroyalties. These administrative divisions were designed to extract wealth from the colonies and funnel it back to Spain. Under the encomienda system, Spanish settlers, called encomenderos, were granted control over indigenous villages. Though not technically enslaved, indigenous people were forced to work, pay tribute, and provide resources to their Spanish overlords in exchange for so-called protection and religious instruction. This system allowed Spanish settlers to extract labor without performing any themselves. In practice, it was slavery by another name. where indigenous people were bound to the land and had no choice but to obey. A brutal institution that granted Spanish settlers control over entire indigenous communities. Forced into relentless labor in mines, fields, and construction projects, indigenous people paid the ultimate price, not just in wealth but in blood. But the tribute system had a flaw. It depended on a stable, large indigenous population, and the Spanish conquest had shattered that stability. War, disease, and social collapse decimated indigenous communities. As populations plummeted, the Spanish faced a crisis. How could they maintain their wealth extraction if the labor force was vanishing? In half a century, the indigenous population of the Americas plummeted from an estimated 60 million to just 6 million. Entire villages were wiped out so quickly that there weren't enough survivors left to bury the dead. Some bodies were left in abandoned cities, while others were thrown into rivers or buried in mass graves. European explorers later found skeletal remains in empty settlements, remnants of civilizations that had collapsed before they even arrived. But as the indigenous population declined, Spain turned to another source of labor: enslaved Africans. While the Caribbean became the primary destination for enslaved Africans, the mainland colonies also relied on their labor. In places like Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, enslaved Africans worked in mines, on plantations, and in cities. Their lives were marked by unimaginable hardship. The conditions were brutal. Enslaved Africans in mines faced cave-ins, toxic fumes, and back-breaking labor. On plantations, they worked long hours under the scorching sun, often with little food or rest. In cities, they were used as domestic servants, artisans, and laborers. Life expectancy was shockingly low. Many did not survive more than a few years after arrival. Spanish America was governed by a rigid social hierarchy known as the casta system. At the top were the Spanish-born elites, followed by criollos, American-born Spaniards, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. This system reinforced racial and social divisions, ensuring that power and privilege remained in the hands of a few. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans resisted. They rebelled, escaped to form maroon communities, and preserved their cultural traditions. Today, their legacy lives on in the vibrant Afro-descendant communities of Latin America. This transition from the tribute system to the plantation economy was not immediate, but over time, as the encomienda system weakened and indigenous resistance mounted, Spain and Portugal fully embraced the African slave trade as their primary means of labor exploitation. It was no longer just about extracting wealth from existing societies. It was about creating entire economies built on human bondage. While Spain built its empire on the forced labor of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, its neighbor Portugal took a different approach. Portugal would become the first European power to dominate the transatlantic slave trade, shipping millions of Africans across the ocean to fuel its growing empire. The Portuguese established trading posts along the West African coast as early as the 1440s. But by the 1500s, these coastal outposts had become centers of the transatlantic slave trade, supplying enslaved Africans not just to Portugal's own colonies, but to the entire European world. While Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, it lacked the infrastructure to source enslaved labor directly from Africa. Instead, it turned to Portugal, which held the Asiento de Negros, a contract granting them the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Through this system, Portuguese traders funneled hundreds of thousands of captives into Hispaniola, Cuba, Mexico, and Peru, ensuring that Spain's mines and sugar plantations had a constant supply of labor. As Portugal expanded its presence in West Africa, a new social class emerged: the mulattoes, the mixed-race descendants of Portuguese men and African women. Unlike in other European colonies, where racial mixing was discouraged, the Portuguese integrated these communities into colonial society. Over time, some mulattoes became interpreters, traders, and local officials. By the 1500s, Portugal had turned Africa into a key supplier of enslaved labor for the Americas. Portuguese traders established direct control over the trade, managing every aspect, from capturing and branding captives to shipping them across the Atlantic. The Portuguese crown controlled major slave trading ports in Angola and Mozambique, ensuring a steady flow of forced labor to its colonies. Unlike later European powers that relied on chartered companies, Portugal ran its slave trade as a state-backed enterprise. By the time Portugal's slave trade ended, it had transported nearly 6 million Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other European nation. The vast majority, around 4.9 million, were sent to Brazil, shaping its demographics, economy, and culture. Another 800,000 to 1 million were sent to Spanish America, while smaller numbers were trafficked to Portugal's Atlantic islands, India, and the Indian Ocean colonies. At the dawn of the Age of Exploration, Spain and Portugal stood unrivaled. Backed by the Catholic Church, these two Iberian powers justified their expansion and the enslavement of millions through religion, conquest, and economic necessity. The papal bulls of the 15th century, including Dum Diversas, 1452, and Romanus Pontifex, 1455, granted Spain and Portugal the right to claim new lands and enslaved non-Christians under the banner of spreading Catholicism. To the ruling monarchs, slavery was not just about wealth, it was a divine mission. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal had reshaped the world. Their explorers had crossed uncharted seas, claiming vast territories in the Americas, seizing control of lucrative trade routes, and amassing unimaginable wealth. Gold and silver flowed from the New World, filling Iberian coffers, funding grand empires, and strengthening their grip on global commerce. But as their power grew, so did the envy of rival European nations. England, France, and the Netherlands watched with frustration, while Spain and Portugal carved up the New World between them under papal decree. Other European powers found themselves locked out of the wealth of the Americas, but they would not remain on the sidelines for long. While Spain and Portugal built their wealth through conquest, slavery, and trade, their European rivals, England, France, and the Netherlands, were not yet strong enough to challenge them directly. Instead, they turned to state-sponsored piracy, hiring privateers to raid Iberian ships, disrupt trade routes, and steal colonial wealth. While establishing their own footholds in the Americas, many of these pirate bases, such as Tortuga, French, Port Royal, English, and Curaçao, Dutch, would evolve into major colonial outposts. For European powers, piracy wasn't just about stealing gold, it was also about taking control of the transatlantic slave trade. Dutch, English, and French privateers frequently raided Portuguese and Spanish slave ships, capturing their human cargo and selling enslaved Africans to their own colonies. These acts of piracy helped shift the balance of power in the slave trade, allowing northern European nations to establish their own supply chains. By the early 17th century, the Dutch had emerged as a major naval power. After winning their independence from Spain, they launched an aggressive campaign to break Iberian dominance over global trade. Unlike Spain and Portugal, who justified their colonial empires through conquest and Catholicism, the Dutch approached expansion as a business. They built their empire through commerce, piracy, and corporate enterprise, turning the transatlantic slave trade into a profit-driven industry. But the Dutch didn't just want a share of the slave trade, they wanted to control it. And to do that, they didn't rely on kings or royal decrees. Instead, they pioneered a new kind of empire, one run not by monarchs, but by corporations and investors. In 1621, the Dutch created the Dutch West India Company, a corporation with the power to wage war, colonize land, and dominate trade. This was more than just a trading company. It was the first attempt to merge private capital with state power. It issued stocks, raised investments, and expanded through military conquest, becoming one of the most powerful institutions of its time. In 1568, the Dutch rebelled against Spanish rule in what became the 80 Years' War. Spain had controlled the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg for decades, imposing heavy taxes and religious restrictions. Led by William of Orange, the Dutch fought for independence, and in doing so, built a powerful navy and financial system to sustain their war efforts. These innovations would later fuel their colonial expansion. By the early 1600s, the Dutch had established themselves as a dominant naval power, using their fleet to disrupt Spanish and Portuguese trade routes. They didn't just fight battles, they attacked Iberian treasure fleets, raided colonies, and seized ports. By the time the war ended in 1648, Spain had recognized Dutch independence, but by then, the Dutch had already built a global trade empire. The Dutch East India Company was not just an arm of the Dutch government, it was the blueprint for modern multinational corporations. It pioneered a system where corporations, not nations, controlled global wealth and resources. This model would later be used by the British East India Company and eventually by the multinational corporations that still dominate global commerce today. The Dutch did not build their empire from scratch, they stole it. Beginning in the 1620s, the Dutch West India Company launched a series of naval and military campaigns to seize Portuguese slave trading outposts. But the Dutch weren't just interested in selling enslaved Africans, they wanted the plantations that depended on them. Their first major victory came in 1624, when they attacked and occupied the city of Salvador in Brazil, the center of Portuguese sugar production. Though the Portuguese recaptured Salvador a year later, the Dutch were not finished. In 1630, they returned, this time capturing Recife and Olinda, turning the northeastern coast of Brazil into a Dutch colony for nearly 25 years. Recife became the capital of Dutch Brazil, a multi-ethnic colony where Dutch rulers attempted to integrate Portuguese settlers, indigenous people, and enslaved Africans under their control. But the Dutch weren't just interested in Brazil, they wanted to control the supply of enslaved labor that fueled its sugar plantations. To do this, they struck at the heart of Portugal's slave trade, West Africa. To control the slave trade, the Dutch first had to take it from Portugal. In the 1620s, the WIC launched a series of military attacks on Portuguese ports and forts. Their first major victory came in 1637, when they captured Elmina Castle in West Africa, one of Portugal's most important slave trading hubs. Then, in 1641, they seized Luanda, Angola, cutting off Portugal's largest supply of enslaved Africans to the Americas. But Dutch ambitions extended beyond the Atlantic. The same military strategy that helped them break Portugal's monopoly on the slave trade also fueled their expansion into Asia, Southern Africa, and North America. In 1624, the Dutch founded New Amsterdam, a small trading post at the mouth of the Hudson River. This colony, later renamed New York by the British, became the center of Dutch influence in North America, connecting the fur trade with transatlantic commerce. In 1652, the Dutch established Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa, creating a critical supply station for ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies. Over time, this settlement grew into a full-fledged colony, setting the stage for centuries of Dutch and later British rule in South Africa. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Dutch East India Company waged brutal wars to seize control of Indonesia from the Portuguese, eventually turning the region into a Dutch colony. They also wrested key trading posts from the Portuguese in India, gaining a foothold in South Asia's lucrative spice trade. By the mid-17th century, Dutch commercial and military power stretched across the Atlantic, Africa, and Asia, all driven by the pursuit of profit, particularly through the trafficking of human lives. With these victories, the Dutch broke Portugal's monopoly on the transatlantic slave trade. Now, they could control the capture, transport, and sale of enslaved Africans, not just for their own colonies, but for Spanish, French, and English buyers as well. The Dutch West India Company wasn't just a trading company. It was the first example of a corporate empire. It controlled vast territories, ran its own military operations, and turned people into commodities for profit. This model, where corporations, not governments, control economies, would later be perfected by the British East India Company, and today, by multinational corporations that still dominate Africa's resources. Though the Dutch Empire faded, its impact never disappeared. The WIC was the first real multinational corporation, proving that wealth and power could be controlled not by kings, but by banks, stock markets, and investors. This model of corporate colonialism would shape the future of Africa, not just under European rule, but even after independence. The story of the Dutch West India Company does not end in the past. It continues today in the hands of the modern financial empires that own Africa's wealth. In the 1600s, European powers began carving up the Atlantic world, driven by profit, conquest, and the growing demand for enslaved African labor. The Portuguese and Spanish were first. The Dutch soon followed, building trade empires backed by corporations and cannons. But it was England that would take the transatlantic slave trade to new extremes. Backed by the crown and armed with growing naval power, the British built forts along the West African coast, captured territories, and established one of the most brutal and far-reaching slave economies in history. England's transformation into a global power began with the Reformation. In 1534, King Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England. This severed England's ties with Catholic Spain and Portugal, pushing the kingdom toward Protestantism and a new independent identity. Under Elizabeth I, England positioned itself as the defender of Protestant Europe, directly opposing Catholic Spain. England's first involvement in the transatlantic slave trade came not through colonization, but through piracy and privateering. In the 1560s, English captains like John Hawkins sailed to West Africa, where they raided coastal villages and kidnapped Africans. They then sold them to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, illegally bypassing Spanish trade laws. This marked the beginning of England's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Though Spain tightly controlled its colonies, English merchants found ways to smuggle enslaved Africans into the Americas, working alongside French and Dutch privateers. By the early 1600s, England turned from piracy to colonization. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, their first permanent settlement in North America. The colony struggled with starvation and conflict with indigenous peoples, but one thing became clear: tobacco was the key to survival. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown, carrying 20 enslaved Africans, the first recorded instance of African slavery in English North America. At first, they were treated similarly to indentured servants, but within decades, race-based slavery became the foundation of the colonial economy. By the mid-1600s, Virginia and other colonies passed laws that made African slavery permanent and hereditary. White indentured servants could earn freedom, but enslaved Africans and their descendants were trapped for life. At the start of the 17th century, the Spanish and Portuguese empires controlled vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But Britain and France saw an opportunity to weaken Spain and Portugal by seizing their colonies and breaking their monopoly over the transatlantic slave trade. In 1655, the British captured Jamaica from Spain, transforming it into a major hub of sugar production and slavery. The French followed suit, seizing Saint-Domingue in 1697, which would become the most profitable colony in the Americas. These early conquests opened the door for Britain and France to expand their influence across the Atlantic, setting the stage for their dominance over the slave trade, global commerce, and imperial expansion. With Jamaica and other Caribbean islands under British control, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, and the rice plantations of South Carolina became some of the most profitable in the world, all dependent on enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade became the backbone of the British economy, funneling millions of Africans into brutal labor on plantations. The creation of the Royal African Company in 1672, backed by the English crown, marked a turning point. This chartered company was granted a monopoly over British trade along the African coast, and it quickly became one of the largest slave trading organizations in the world. British investors, plantation owners, and merchants grew immensely wealthy, fueling the rise of a powerful merchant class. In 1664, the British seized Cape Coast Castle from the Swedes, turning it into their primary stronghold. Just a few years later, they built Fort James in Accra, establishing yet another outpost for the growing human trafficking network. By the late 1600s, Britain had overtaken the Dutch and Portuguese to become the dominant force in the transatlantic slave trade. Between the late 1600s and early 1800s, tens of thousands of Africans passed through these coastal prisons each year, bound for brutal lives in plantations across the Atlantic. One of the greatest scholars to expose the true scale of the transatlantic slave trade was W.E.B. Du Bois. In his groundbreaking book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, published in 1895. Du Bois revealed that Britain trafficked more enslaved Africans than Portugal did in the previous 300 years. By the time Britain abolished the trade in 1807, it had transported at least 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more enslaved Africans in a short span than any other nation in history. The British economy was built on slavery. The wealth generated from human trafficking did not stay in the Caribbean. It was reinvested into Britain's industries, ports, and banking system. By the 1700s, slavery-funded wealth powered the Industrial Revolution. Cotton mills in Manchester thrived, using raw materials grown by enslaved Africans in the Americas. Shipbuilding in Liverpool and Bristol boomed as thousands of slave ships were constructed to transport cargo. Sugar processing plants and rum distilleries in Britain transformed Caribbean crops into highly profitable commodities. The entire British economy was tied to slavery, from the plantations in the Americas to the factories and banks in London. As Britain's slave-based economy grew, so did the power of its merchants. By the late 1600s, a new class of rich traders, bankers, and shipbuilders emerged, many of them richer than the nobility. These wealthy merchants demanded more influence over government, challenging the authority of the monarchy. The king, who once ruled by divine right, now found himself in conflict with a class of men who controlled Britain's wealth. King Charles I's taxation policies angered these new elites, leading to the English Civil War between 1642 to 1651 and his execution in 1649. After a brief republic under Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy was restored, but tensions remained. By 1688, these tensions exploded into the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament, backed by merchants and wealthy elites, forced King James II from the throne. Rather than face execution like Charles I, James II fled to France, where he spent the rest of his life in exile. The Glorious Revolution permanently weakened the monarchy and marked the rise of Parliament as the dominant force in British politics. With Parliament now in control of British trade policy, Britain began an aggressive expansion of its transatlantic slave trade and colonial empire. By the mid-18th century, Britain was no longer just an empire. It was the dominant force in global trade, powered by slavery, colonial exploitation, and a financial system built on human suffering. The vast profits from the transatlantic slave trade, which had once been controlled by the Royal African Company, now flowed into private merchants, banks, and the British Crown itself. These profits fueled the rise of Britain's industrial cities, Liverpool, Bristol, and London, transforming them into financial centers that dominated the global economy. As W.E.B. Du Bois documented, Britain transported over 3 million enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was not only the foundation of Britain's Caribbean and North American colonies, but it also directly funded the British military, navy, and banking system. The scale was staggering. By the early 18th century, British traders were moving tens of thousands of enslaved Africans per year, with the Asiento of 1713 granting Britain control over the Spanish slave trade. This deal expanded Britain's reach even further, pushing their numbers to 15,000 enslaved Africans per year to Spanish colonies alone, a number that only grew as private merchants joined the trade. With this wealth secured, Britain turned its attention to territorial conquest beyond the Atlantic, expanding into South Africa, India, and Egypt, the British sought not just to control trade, but to dominate entire economies and political systems. In 1795, Britain seized Cape Colony from the Dutch, a critical move in their effort to control the Indian Ocean trade routes. Although the Dutch briefly regained it in 1803, Britain permanently occupied the colony in 1806. With this, they secured a powerful foothold in southern Africa, which would later serve as the launchpad for deeper colonial expansion into the continent. While South Africa provided a strategic naval base, India was Britain's greatest economic prize. The British East India Company, which had begun as a trading enterprise in 1600, had by the mid-18th century transformed into a military power, ruling over vast Indian territories. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where British forces defeated Indian rulers and established control over Bengal, the wealthiest province in India. Over the next century, Britain expanded its hold, using military force, economic manipulation, and alliances with local elites to bring more of India under its rule. By 1858, following a massive rebellion against British rule, the British government abolished the East India Company and took direct control of India, making it the crown jewel of the British Empire. Britain's final great conquest in this era came in 1882, when it invaded Egypt and took control of the Suez Canal, the most crucial trade route connecting Europe to Asia. The canal was essential for maintaining Britain's dominance in global trade and military logistics. With the occupation of Egypt, Britain solidified its control over both Africa and Asia, securing its position as the world's most powerful empire. By the late 19th century, Britain had become the largest empire in history, controlling nearly 1/4 of the world's land and population. From North America to the Caribbean, from Africa to India, and from Australia to the Pacific Islands, Britain's influence stretched across the globe. However, this empire was not built on freedom or justice. It was built on enslavement, violence, and economic exploitation. For centuries, the British justified their empire as a force for civilization and progress, claiming they were bringing order to the world. But in reality, it was a system designed to extract wealth, strip nations of their independence, and consolidate power in the hands of a few. When most people imagine the founding of the United States, they picture liberty, hard work, and a blank canvas. But the land wasn't blank. It was already inhabited, cultivated, and defended by indigenous nations who had lived here for thousands of years. These were not scattered tribes, but organized nations with governance, diplomacy, and territorial control. European colonization began by ignoring these facts. The British Crown issued land charters and patents as if the continent were uninhabited, drawing lines through native homelands and handing them over to settlers, companies, and elites. This wasn't settlement, it was theft, legalized by paperwork and backed by violence. As the English, French, Spanish, and Dutch jockeyed for position, native nations resisted. Wars broke out, treaties were signed and broken, but indigenous people were steadily pushed westward through forced removal, military conquest, and land speculation schemes. Colonial governments saw land as the basis for wealth, power, and social order. From the beginning, this land was distributed not based on merit or fairness, but on proximity to power. The people who would become the first American elites did not discover America. They were handed pieces of it by a king who didn't own it, and they defended it with policies and weapons that prioritized their wealth over native lives. The colonial story begins not with freedom, but with seizure. And from that seizure, the American landed class was born. While the Crown gave away land, it did not do so at a loss. The British Empire profited politically, strategically, and economically by distributing land to loyal officers, investors, and elite families. The Crown expanded its territorial claims without having to finance large settler operations directly. These landowners acted as imperial agents, bringing British law, religion, and commercial interest into contested areas. Military officers were rewarded with land grants instead of cash, saving the Crown money while cultivating a loyal colonial leadership. These men upheld British authority and served as buffers against rival powers and indigenous resistance. As settlements grew, the land itself became productive, generating exports like tobacco and timber that fueled British industry. Colonists were taxed on trade, and customs duties enriched imperial coffers. In this way, the land grants were an investment in imperial infrastructure. Though not always immediately profitable, they laid the foundation for long-term colonial wealth that benefited the empire through loyalty, expansion, and economic integration. But how did the British Crown come to believe it had the authority to claim these lands in the first place? The answer lies in a blend of religious justification, imperial ambition, and symbolic acts of possession. Based on the doctrine of discovery, a legal and religious principle rooted in papal bulls of the 15th century, European Christian monarchies claimed the right to seize non-Christian lands. Indigenous nations, regardless of their sovereignty or civilization, were seen as subjects to be converted, subdued, or ignored. English claims to North America began with explorers like John Cabot, who, in 1497, sailing under commission from King Henry VII, landed in Newfoundland and claimed the territory for England. This act of symbolic possession, planting a flag, making a declaration, set the precedent. Over the following century, English monarchs issued land charters to private companies and favored individuals, treating foreign territory as royal property to be parceled out at will. These acts were backed by military force, colonial militias, and settlement policies that erased native land claims. King James I, 1603 to 1625. The first giveaway. King James I was the first English monarch to grant land in America. In 1606, he issued the Virginia Charter to the Virginia companies. From the swamps of Jamestown grew dynasties that would rule Virginia and the South for generations. The Byrds, the Carters, the Lees, the Randolphs, families whose names became synonymous with land, wealth, and power, built on the backs of enslaved labor and stolen land. King Charles I, 1625 to 1649. Expansion for the elite. King Charles I expanded land giveaways. In 1632, he granted Maryland to Lord Baltimore, a proprietary colony. Land became a tool to reward nobles and build personal empires. Colonial elites didn't discover America. They inherited pieces of it through royal favors. Still, on the ground, settlers faced indigenous resistance at every step. King Charles II, 1660 to 1685, the biggest giveaway. After the monarchy was restored after the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, Charles II rewarded loyalty with land on a massive scale. In 1663, he gave the Carolinas to 8 noble supporters. In 1664, he seized New Netherland, renamed it New York, and gave it to his brother. In 1681, he gave Pennsylvania to William Penn to settle royal debt. In total, Charles II handed out hundreds of millions of acres. But ownership on paper didn't stop native resistance. Conquest, war, and removal were necessary to make the grants real. King James II, 1685 to 1688. James II focused less on new grants and more on tightening royal control. He tried to consolidate colonies under the dominion of New England. His reign ended quickly with the Glorious Revolution. Settlers kept expanding on land already stolen or promised. The wars never stopped. William III and Mary II, 1689 to 1702. Control over colonies. No major new land grants. They shifted their focus to trade control and taxation. Colonial society hardened into a structure where land ownership meant whiteness and power. Slavery was expanding, and colonies were starting to become extremely profitable. Queen Anne, 1702 to 1714. She focused on European wars rather than American expansion. Colonies continued to spread westward, often without direct royal permission. The hunger for land and the violence that came with it had become a self-sustaining machine. King George I, 1714 to 1727, little new growth, oversaw the colonies passively. No major new land grants, but colonial populations swelled and indigenous displacement continued. King George II, 1727 to 1760, the last king to grant land. In 1732, he approved the creation of Georgia, the final of the 13 original colonies. Land was given to James Oglethorpe and trustees, a buffer against Spanish Florida. After Georgia, no major land grants were made. The crown shifted toward taxing and controlling what it already claimed. The American landed class didn't build their wealth from the ground up. They inherited it through royal favor and family connections. The British Crown distributed millions of acres of native land to favored subjects, often in the form of massive land grants. These grants were given to loyal military officers, wealthy investors, and politically connected families who had ties to the monarchy. The recipients didn't have to pay for the land. It was a gift of imperial patronage. Much of this land was allocated through outright nepotism. Colonial elites passed property to sons, brothers, and sons-in-law, consolidating land holdings within extended dynasties. Political appointments and marriages became tools for expanding land empires. These networks ensured that land ownership and the power it brought remained confined to a narrow group of white families with elite status. George Washington is a prime example. While he gained some land through his work as a surveyor, a person who measured and mapped land boundaries to determine property lines and assign ownership, the vast majority of his wealth came through inheritance from his family and marriage. Surveying became a powerful tool in this era. Men like George Washington rose by learning to map and measure the stolen land. Surveyors didn't just mark borders. They spotted the best land first, claimed it, and flipped it for enormous profit. It was a way for young men from landholding or ambitious families to enter land speculation, politics, and wealth. Surveying opened the door to land speculation, political influence, and wealth. It wasn't just a job, it was a ticket into the colonial elite. Washington's older half-brother Lawrence Washington had powerful connections with the likes of the Fairfax family, who helped George get appointed. Washington inherited land from his father, Augustine Washington, a prominent planter who owned thousands of acres. Augustine acquired much of this land through royal grants, speculative purchases, and connections with Virginia's elite planter class. As a justice of the peace and trusted figure in colonial society, Augustine had access to some of the most coveted land available. Upon his father's death, George received significant holdings and later expanded his estate further by marrying Martha Custis, a wealthy widow who brought even more land and enslaved laborers into the Union. Washington also received land grants for his military service and continued to grow his holdings through surveys, purchases, and speculation. He rented land to tenants, sold parcels for profit, and relied heavily on enslaved labor to farm his estates. Thomas Jefferson's rise followed a similar path. Born into the powerful Randolph family, one of Virginia's most influential dynasties, he inherited over 5,000 acres. The Randolphs received their land through royal grants, speculative acquisitions, and early political connections that dated back to the formative years of the Virginia colony. The family's influence stretched across multiple branches, ensuring that land and status remained in elite hands. Jefferson used enslaved labor to build Monticello and manage his plantations, and he expanded his wealth through speculation and land purchases. These men were not unique. Across the colonies, especially in the South, a relatively small group of elite families amassed enormous landholdings through inheritance, royal patronage, and political favoritism. Families like the Washingtons, Randolphs, Lees, and Carters controlled tens of thousands of acres and shaped colonial politics, law, and trade. Within these dynasties, land and power were distributed among siblings and extended family, reinforcing class dominance. The landed aristocracy used legal tools like primogeniture, passing land to the eldest son, to prevent estates from being divided. Younger sons were often provided with land from other family branches or married into land-rich families. These strategies preserved wealth across generations. In the North, the dynamic was somewhat different. Large estates existed, especially in parts of New York and Pennsylvania, but the society was generally more commercially oriented and less dominated by a rigid aristocracy. Land was more often distributed in smaller plots to individual families or townships, and religious groups like the Quakers emphasized flatter hierarchies. Still, property ownership remained a requirement for voting and office holding. and northern elites often controlled banking, shipping, and legal systems. Compared to the north, the southern landed class was larger in scale and more deeply tied to slavery. These elites rented land to tenants, leased it to overseers, and profited from its sale. Land was not just a resource, it was a financial asset, a social position, and a tool of political power. Their vast estates functioned as self-contained economies, powered by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. These men became America's political leaders because they were already its economic elite. Their control of land ensured they controlled lawmaking, military defense, and colonial expansion. Population growth in the early colonies primarily reflected the influx of white settlers and the forced migration of enslaved Africans. By 1650, the total colonial population was approximately 50,000, consisting largely of white settlers and a growing but still relatively small number of enslaved Africans. As the colonies expanded, demographic trends increasingly diverged by race, with enslaved Africans comprising a larger share of the southern population by the early 1700s. The colonial elite didn't rise by accident. They rose because land was granted to them and labor was provided for them. Before America was a nation, it was already a hierarchy built on land, race, and law. In the early 1600s, most of the labor in the colonies was done by indentured servants, poor Europeans who agreed to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for a chance at freedom. Most indentured servants were poor whites, criminals, and debtors, people too desperate to survive in Europe. They sold years of their lives to work off the cost of their passage to America. They dreamed that after their service, they could move to the frontier, claim their own piece of land, and build a life. But freedom was never easy. Mortality rates were brutally high. In the early colonies, half or more of indentured servants died before completing their contracts. Not from violence or starvation, but mostly from disease, from poor hygiene, sanitary practices, malaria, dysentery, typhoid fever, and smallpox that swept through overcrowded settlements, killing thousands before they ever saw freedom. And even those who survived were often pushed onto the roughest lands at the edges of the colonies, onto native territories, sparking constant warfare as the frontier expanded westward. In 1675, indentured servants still outnumbered enslaved Africans across the colonies, but the system was reaching a breaking point. In 1676, the fragile social order cracked. Bacon's Rebellion erupted in Virginia, a revolt led by poor whites and enslaved Africans united against the wealthy planter class. For a moment, class, not race, united the oppressed, and it terrified the elite. They realized that the unification of poor whites and black laborers was the biggest threat to their position of power. If poor whites and black workers remained united, the entire plantation system could collapse. In response to Bacon's rebellion, the plantation class acted quickly and decisively. They made deliberate efforts to shift away from indentured servants and toward permanent black slavery. They passed new laws. Slavery became lifelong and hereditary, binding black people and their children into bondage forever. Children inherited the status of their mother, guaranteeing an ever-growing enslaved labor force. Interracial marriage was outlawed to prevent alliances between poor whites and Africans. White indentured servants were promised land, guns, and legal rights, buying their loyalty and driving a wedge between the races. The Southern elite built their power not on the backs of poor whites, but on royal land grants and the stolen labor of enslaved Africans. Poor whites were given a different role, not to build wealth but to protect it, securing their power by dividing those beneath them. A racial caste system replaced temporary class alliances. Freedom became a reward for whiteness. Bondage became the permanent fate of blackness. Over the next 50 years, the transformation was unmistakable. By the 1680s, the number of indentured servants and enslaved Africans across the colonies was roughly equal, with about 10,000 to 15,000 each. By 1750, the number of indentured servants had dropped to fewer than 5,000, while the enslaved population had grown to over 200,000. By 1776, indentured servitude had almost disappeared, and nearly 500,000 black people were enslaved across the 13 colonies. Slavery wasn't just part of the economy. Now it was the economy. By the time of the American Revolution, the foundation was laid. The colonial elite had positioned themselves to seize control of the colonies, to challenge the monarchy, and to build a new nation on their terms. They controlled the land, they controlled the laws, and they had built a profitable economy, poised for rapid growth, fueled by perpetual black labor. They also crafted a social order that would serve their ambitions. A rising poor white class promised land and opportunity, pushing westward to seize native territories. They were turned into slave patrols, militias, overseers, and later sheriffs and police. Their job was to protect the wealth and power of the southern elite. They didn't get the land, they didn't get the riches. They got just enough status and a role in policing black labor to stay loyal to the system that kept them poor too. Even as poor whites labored without land or wealth, they were given one thing to hold on to: the idea that no matter how bad their lives were, at least they weren't black. It was a lie, but a powerful one. A lie that would divide America for centuries and secured the racial hierarchy that kept black people in permanent bondage. The wealth, the freedom, and the power that would define America were rooted not just in ideals, but in a system designed to divide, conquer, and extract. A system where liberty was reserved for the few, and where expansion, wealth, and control were built on stolen lives and stolen lands. While southern elites built their fortunes on land and enslaved labor, a different empire was rising in the north. An empire built not in fields, but on ships, trade, and silent partnerships with slavery. The northern colonies would later claim the moral high ground in America's battles over slavery. But the truth is far more complicated. Beneath the surface of northern prosperity lay a brutal truth. Land was handed freely to white settlers by colonial governments, while black people, whether free or enslaved, were excluded from ownership and opportunity. The hidden history of northern wealth begins with who was allowed to own the land and who was not. Massachusetts Bay was the flagship of northern colonial power, but it was not alone. Across New England, in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, and later in the middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, the same system repeated itself. Land handed freely to white settlers, black people excluded from ownership, and an economy deeply tied to the profits of slavery. In this episode, we uncover how the northern elite rose to power, the origin of northern immigration, and its deep economic ties to slavery through trade, shipping, and finance. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630, was no ordinary settlement. It was launched by wealthy Puritan investors under a royal charter, a religious mission tied directly to a commercial enterprise. Unlike the struggling settlers of Jamestown, the Puritan founders of Massachusetts Bay were already successful before they ever crossed the Atlantic. Many were merchants, landowners, shipbuilders, lawyers, and professionals from England's booming economy. They profited from the wool trade, cloth manufacturing, and maritime shipping. They belonged to England's rising middle class, a group wealthy enough to envision a new society, yet still locked out of aristocratic power at home. Faced with religious repression and limited political prospects under King Charles I, they invested their fortunes into a bold new project, the creation of a city on a hill in New England, a place where they could control their destiny, expand their wealth, and build a society in their own image. The Massachusetts Bay Company was, at its core, a corporate enterprise. Its investors expected returns. Land grants were distributed for free to approved settlers, white Puritans who met religious and political conditions. Trade routes were planned. Towns were organized not just around churches, but around commerce. Massachusetts Bay grew rapidly because it was designed to build on planning, investment, and the free distribution of land. The founders of Massachusetts Bay were driven by more than commercial ambition. They were part of the Puritan movement, strict Protestants who believed the Church of England remained too close to Catholicism. Under King Charles I, religious repression deepened as the king supported high church practices and sought to silence Puritan voices. Facing political and religious exile, the Puritan elite sought to build a new society across the Atlantic, one where their religious vision could thrive and where their economic ambitions could take root. Massachusetts Bay was the first major English colony to succeed on a large scale in North America, where Jamestown in the south had nearly collapsed multiple times from disease, famine, and war. Massachusetts Bay grew rapidly, built on careful planning, a healthy climate, religious unity, and broad land distribution to white settlers. Massachusetts Bay had succeeded where others had failed, but to truly understand how its founders shaped the colony's future, and how they built an economy that would shape the entire northern elite, we need to go back, before their arrival in America, to the origins of the Puritan movement and the roots of their wealth. The Atlantic world had already been reshaped by Spanish and Portuguese expansion. In the 1500s, Spain controlled vast colonial empires in the Americas, while Portugal dominated early Atlantic slave trading routes and coastal Africa. England, though slower to establish its own colonies, found ways to profit. Through fishing the rich cod waters off Newfoundland, illegal trade with Spanish colonies, and state-sanctioned privateering against Spanish treasure fleets. During this period, a rising English merchant class grew wealthy, and many Puritans were among them. Puritan merchants, ship owners, cloth traders, and investors benefited from expanding Atlantic commerce long before England's own colonies matured. Although England's first permanent colonies, Virginia, Bermuda, and Barbados, were not established until the early 1600s, Puritan businessmen were already profiting from Atlantic trade and the emerging Atlantic slave economy. Many Puritans or Puritan-sympathizing merchants backed voyages that preyed on Spanish shipping and later helped finance England's entrance into colonial plantation economies. They were not pirates themselves, but Puritans profited indirectly from privateering, legalized piracy. By the early 1600s, the Puritan merchant class had both the resources and ambition to challenge royal power. Religious repression under King Charles I, combined with heavy taxation, corrupt royal monopolies, and restrictions on trade, fueled growing resentment across England's rising commercial class. Tensions boiled over in 1642. Parliament, heavily backed by Puritans and merchant elites, raised its own armies and openly defied the king. The English Civil War had begun, a brutal struggle between royalists loyal to King Charles I and parliamentarians seeking to reshape England's future. The conflict was not only religious, it was economic, a battle over who would control the wealth of an expanding empire. The old aristocracy tied to divine kingship, or the new merchant and landowning class, rising through commerce and industry. By 1649, the unimaginable happened. King Charles I was captured, put on public trial for treason, and executed. For the first time in European history, a sitting monarch was overthrown by his own people. England briefly became a republic, ruled by Parliament and Puritan generals under Oliver Cromwell. But the Puritan experiment in England would not last. After Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, the country fell into chaos. In 1660, the monarchy was restored when Charles II, son of the executed king, was invited back to the throne. One of the first acts of the restored monarchy was to erase all traces of the Puritan Republic's constitutional reforms. The return of royal power crushed Puritan political influence in England. Many Puritans, once powerful at home, now looked even more urgently to America as the true refuge for their faith, their fortunes, and their future. The seeds of division were already planted. In America, just as in England, two elite classes would emerge. A plantation aristocracy tied to the crown in the South, and a merchant-led society shaped by Puritan ambition in the North. Two visions of land, labor, and wealth. Two futures on a collision course. For many Puritans, the chaos of the English Civil War was not a defeat, it was a divine signal, a calling to cross the Atlantic, to escape the corruption of the old world, and to build a new society where faith, commerce, and destiny could rise together. As England fell back into royal control, the Puritans in America were building a success story of their own. Massachusetts Bay had grown rapidly, built on careful planning, religious unity, a healthier climate, and broad land distribution to white settlers. Between 1630 and 1640, the Massachusetts Bay Colony's population exploded from around 1,000 settlers to over 20,000 people. the result of what became known as the Great Migration. Compared to the fragile settlements in the South, New England offered healthier living conditions, a more balanced family structure, and stronger community institutions. But the story of Massachusetts Bay was not just one of faith and farming. It was a story of commerce, shipping, and deepening ties to the Atlantic slave economy. While over 20,000 Puritans settled in Massachusetts Bay during the Great Migration, an even larger number of English settlers, many also Puritans, migrated to the Caribbean. There, they helped build the brutal sugar plantation economies that fueled the Atlantic slave system. The northern elite may have distanced themselves from plantation slavery in public, but their rise was part of a larger movement deeply tied to colonial wealth and exploitation across the Atlantic world. Massachusetts Bay merchants quickly found their place in the Atlantic economy. They shipped timber, dried fish, livestock, and manufactured goods to the Caribbean sugar plantations, and in return, they brought back sugar, molasses, and sometimes enslaved Africans. Boston, Salem, and Newport became busy ports, not only for colonial trade, but for the brutal triangular trade that fueled the Atlantic world. New England rum, made from Caribbean molasses, became a central product in the economy, sold locally, shipped to Africa to purchase slaves, or traded for more goods. Even though New England never developed large plantation systems like the South, its economy was deeply entangled with slavery. Northern merchants financed voyages, insured slave ships, built vessels for the trade, and supplied plantation economies with food and materials. By the late 1600s, Rhode Island, a small New England colony, had become one of the largest centers of the North American slave trade. Newport alone accounted for a staggering percentage of all American slave voyages in the 18th century. Massachusetts Bay and the broader New England economy were not isolated from slavery. They were part of the same Atlantic system, profiting through shipping, trade, rum production, and financial services. Even as they told themselves a different story of moral superiority, the northern elite was not separate from the foundations of slavery. They were deeply invested, commercially, financially, and structurally, in a system that extracted wealth through human suffering. New England's churches preached righteousness. Its merchants practiced ruthless commerce. The wealth generated by New England's trade with the slave economies did not remain scattered. It concentrated into the hands of a rising class of merchants, ship owners, and financiers. Families who controlled shipping fleets, rum distilleries, and trade houses began accumulating fortunes that rivaled the great plantation owners of the South. But unlike the Southern aristocracy, built on land and labor, the northern elite built their empires through commerce, finance, and control of trade routes. At the same time, New England's population exploded. From just over 20,000 settlers in 1640, the region grew to more than 100,000 by the early 1700s. Towns expanded, small farms spread inland, and entire communities were built around trade, shipping, and agriculture. White settlers were given land grants, opening doors to independence, wealth, and social status. Meanwhile, free black people, even those born in New England, were systematically excluded from land ownership and political rights. They were often pushed to the margins, denied the very opportunities that helped lift ordinary white settlers into prosperity. Even small farmers who owned no slaves directly benefited from the larger Atlantic system. They sold food, timber, and livestock that fed the plantation economies of the Caribbean. Their markets, their profits, and their community wealth depended on the demand created by the vast slave-driven plantation system. In coastal towns, owning an enslaved person became a status symbol, a visible sign of wealth and standing, even among households that did not depend on slavery for labor. Ministers, merchants, and artisans in New England commonly owned one or two enslaved Africans, not out of economic necessity, but as an expression of social position. By the early 1700s, New England had produced a new kind of aristocracy, one less visible than the grand plantation mansions of the South, but no less dependent on systems of exclusion and exploitation. The northern elite had risen, quietly, commercially, and with a hand always in the Atlantic economy. In the South, the plantation aristocracy tied poor whites to the defense of slavery through race and social status. In the North, the merchant elite built a different system, offering free land, civic participation, and economic opportunity to white settlers, while systematically excluding free black people. Both systems created loyalty among the white population. Both systems depended on the wealth generated by enslaved labor, directly in the South, indirectly in the North. The northern elite had claimed the mantle of free labor and moral virtue, but beneath the surface they had built their wealth on the same foundations of exclusion, exploitation, and racial inequality. The story of the northern elite is not a story of innocence. It is the beginning of the story of how wealth, land, and opportunity were handed to one group, while others were locked out by design. It is a story of how a region that prided itself on free labor quietly built its prosperity on the same system of human suffering it would later condemn. In the North, slavery was not seen. It was shipped, traded, insured, and financed, hidden behind the language of commerce and progress. Beneath the sermons and small towns, a powerful elite was rising, built not on freedom, but on exclusion, and the legacy of that system would shape the nation that followed. The scramble for Africa was one of the largest mass killings in history. Nearly 20 million people were killed, a human toll greater than some of the most infamous tragedies of the modern era. Most deaths were due to war, massacres, forced labor, starvation, and disease under colonial rule. Across Africa, resistance is met with ruthless firepower. The British, French, Germans, Belgians, and Portuguese unleashed their military forces. The Maxim gun, a new and deadly weapon, cuts down warriors by the thousands. Entire cities are burned, leaders are executed, and the grip of colonial rule tightens. The British Empire stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the gold mines of South Africa. Their strategy is one of control, diplomacy where it suits them, military force where it does not. In 1879, the Zulu warriors faced the British at Isandlwana, armed only with spears and shields. Their courage is unmatched, but against the might of British rifles, thousands fall. In Sudan, the Mahdist resistance wages war, only to be crushed by British artillery. And in South Africa, the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, are locked in a brutal war that will see 75,000 people perish, many in British concentration camps. With each conquest, Britain expands its economic empire, turning African lands into plantations and mines that fuel its industries. Entire communities are uprooted and forced into labor, living and dying in conditions unfit for animals. By 1914, Britain controls over 30% of Africa, its wealth built on the backs of the colonized. France pursues empire not just with the gun, but with the mind. Their policy of assimilation seeks to erase African identities, replacing them with French culture, language, and law. But African resistance does not break so easily. In West Africa, Samurai Touré fights for nearly 2 decades, building an empire that defies French rule until his capture. In Algeria, over 800,000 people perish in the fight against colonial rule. And in Madagascar, entire communities are uprooted as France imposes its dominion. Through forced labor and economic exploitation, France's empire thrives, its cities in Europe growing richer, while African lives are spent like currency. Over 1.5 million Africans die under French colonial rule. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Women and children slaughtered to send a message, submit or be exterminated. No colony sees more horror than the Congo Free State, the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Here, men, women, and children are forced to harvest rubber under threat of the whip. For every basket of rubber not filled, a hand is severed. Villages that fail to meet quotas are burned to the ground. Between 5 to 10 million people perish. Their deaths, a silent echo beneath the wealth that flows to Belgium. Infants were torn from their mothers, men beaten to death, and women raped by colonial officers for sport. Only when the world learns of these horrors does the Belgian government strip Leopold of his colony. But the suffering does not end. The scars left on the Congo will never fully heal. Germany arrives late to the race for Africa, but its rule is among the most violent. In German Southwest Africa, Namibia, the Herero and Nama people rise up against oppression. The German response is not war, it is extermination. Driven into the desert, men, women, and children are left to die of thirst. Concentration camps are filled with starving prisoners. Over 80% of the Herero people vanish from the earth. German soldiers were given explicit orders: kill every Herero, man, woman, and child. In Tanzania, the Maji Maji rebellion fights against German rule. In retaliation, German troops burn crops, poison wells, and slaughter entire villages, leaving over 250,000 dead. Portugal was one of the first European nations to step foot in Africa, but in the era of the scramble, it struggles to hold its territories in Angola and Mozambique. Through brutal forced labor and economic exploitation, Portugal maintains control. Entire generations are enslaved, working plantations until they collapse from exhaustion. Unlike Britain and France, it refuses to leave even after World War II, clinging to its colonies until the revolutions of the 1970s. The scramble for Africa was not just a conquest of land, it was a conquest of lives. Nearly 20 million souls perished, their sacrifices buried beneath the wealth of empires. The conquest of Africa was not only fought on the battlefield, it was fought with deception. European powers lied, manipulated, and betrayed African leaders, using false promises of alliances, protection, and trade to turn brother against brother. In Ghana, the British signed treaties with local kings under the pretense of partnership, only to later declare their territories part of the British Empire without consent. In Uganda, the British promised King Mwanga the second protection from rival factions, only to exile him once their power was secure. In Nigeria, the British signed the 1885 treaty with the Oba of Benin, promising peace. Yet, in 1897, they launched a brutal invasion, burning Benin City to the ground and looting its treasures. The French deceived West African rulers into believing they would maintain their autonomy, only to later strip them of power and enslave their people. These betrayals shattered African unity and paved the way for the full-scale occupation of the continent. The few rulers who resisted were demonized, hunted, and exterminated. The consequences of the scramble for Africa did not stay contained to the continent. The very competition for land and power that fueled European expansion into Africa also set the stage for World War I. The rivalries between Britain, France, and Germany, escalated by colonial ambitions, led directly to the tensions that exploded in 1914. Germany, a latecomer to empire building, wanted more colonial territory. Britain and France, already dominant, sought to block its expansion. The military buildup and arms race that had been used to dominate Africa was now turned against Europe itself. The African colonies were drawn into the war, forced to send millions of men as soldiers and laborers to fight and die in a conflict that was not theirs. Over 2 million Africans were conscripted, and more than 1.5 million died. The scars of World War I did not heal. Instead, they festered. Europe once again collapsed into global conflict in 1939. This time, the war would not only destroy cities, it would shatter empires. The same nations that once carved up Africa were now in ruins, their economies in collapse, their treasuries emptied. The colonial powers that had once ruled with an iron fist could no longer afford their global dominance, but they would not leave Africa without a plan. The empires may have fallen, but their influence had to remain. And so, Europe devised a new strategy, not through military force, but through economic chains, political puppets, and a system designed to keep Africa dependent, even after so-called independence. By 1945, Europe was in ruins. London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels were devastated. The cost of war had been too great. Once mighty colonial empires could no longer fund their armies, no longer maintain their vast overseas territories. Britain was bankrupt, surviving only because of loans from the United States. France had lost control of its colonies during the Nazi occupation, exposing its military weakness. Belgium, which had profited immensely from the brutal exploitation of the Congo, was now economically crippled. Portugal and Spain, long-standing colonial powers, were too poor to resist the tide of decolonization. For the first time in centuries, Europe needed Africa more than Africa needed Europe. But rather than allow true independence, They chose a new form of control, economic exploitation, disguised as liberation. As African liberation movements grew stronger, Europe faced a dilemma. Direct colonial rule was no longer sustainable, but simply abandoning their African territories would mean losing access to the gold, diamonds, oil, rubber, and agricultural wealth that had fueled their economies for centuries. And so a plan was devised: gradual independence. Instead of fighting to hold on to their colonies, European powers began negotiating peaceful transfers of power. New African governments were established, but only under leaders handpicked by European powers. Economic policies were put in place that ensured that African resources would still flow into European economies, even after colonialism officially ended. This was not true independence, it was neo-colonialism. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe needed raw materials to rebuild its cities, factories, and economies. Where would they get them? From Africa. The British Commonwealth system ensured that former British colonies would keep trading primarily with Britain. France created the CFA franc, a currency that forced West African economies to remain under French control. Belgium ensured its corporations still controlled Congo's mineral wealth, even after independence was granted. Africa became the economic engine that allowed Europe to recover, but Africans themselves saw little benefit. Railroads built in Africa were not for Africans. They were designed to export raw materials to Europe. Agricultural policies favored the production of cash crops, cotton, coffee, rubber, while African people faced food shortages. Foreign companies took control of African industries, ensuring that profits still flowed out of the continent. For Africa, independence was a political illusion. The real power remained in European hands. To maintain control, Europe left Africa divided, weakened, and easy to manipulate. Borders were drawn to create ethnic and political conflicts, ensuring African nations would be too divided to unite against European interests. Key nationalist leaders were assassinated or overthrown, often with European or American backing. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, all removed because they sought true independence. Military coups were encouraged and funded, keeping corrupt, pro-Western leaders in power while the people suffered. Where colonial rulers once held the whip, now African leaders, handpicked by the West, did their bidding. Even today, Africa remains trapped in a system designed to benefit the former colonial powers. Many African nations were forced to take massive loans from the International Monetary Fund, which came with conditions that favored European and American interests. Western corporations still dominate Africa's oil, mining, and agriculture, ensuring that profits go overseas rather than into African communities. French troops remain stationed in West Africa, while the US and Europe continue to back leaders who serve their interests. This is not freedom, this is economic slavery. The scramble for Africa did not end with colonial rule. It simply changed form. Europe's empires collapsed, but their control remained. Africa did not destroy Europe. Europe destroyed itself. The greed, violence, and arrogance that fueled the scramble for Africa eventually led to their own downfall. But their system of control survived. The battle for independence was never about flags or national anthems. It was about true sovereignty, economic freedom, and African self-determination. And that battle is not over. The question remains, when will Africa finally break free?